Welcome back to another episode of Health is Wealth. And thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. And as always, I am beyond grateful and thankful to each and every one of you who is tuning into today's episode and tuning in to support the podcast. As every week, I am dropping a new episode on Sunday just to share some words and thoughts of just things that I'm learning on my own crazy journey in this ride we call life. Things that I'm learning for the first time, things that I'm getting to understand at a different point of view, in hopes that it brings value into your life today to perhaps inspire you, motivate you. Maybe you learn something new today or see something in a different point of view. And if anything, just get a chance to know who I am and the mission that I am on in life. And so what I wanted to talk about in today's episode was, this idea that oftentimes in order for us to move forward, sometimes we have to move backwards. We have to take a step back. And I got this from listening to a podcast with Andy Frisella. If you're not familiar with him, he is the founder of 1st Phorm, which is one of the biggest fitness companies that sells apparel and supplements, energy drinks, etc. And on this podcast, he was talking about this very thing that, often we need to step backwards in order to move forwards, right? And it comes in many different ways and at different points of our lives. But it's very true. Sometimes we might feel stuck, right? And sometimes it takes us having to take a few steps back, in life for us to move forward. And just kind of an example for me, right? About a couple of years ago, I made a transition with work. I work in the construction field. I work as an electrician doing low voltage. And there was an opportunity for me to leave a company that I was currently with for the company that I'm currently employed with now. Now, I had spent, a few years, had already working for the previous company. And there kind of came a point, where I kind of maxed out with what I was able to make, as far as my wage per hour, right? So I kind of capped out, didn't really have anywhere to advance, in that timing, right, of where I was at. So there was an opportunity for me to move forward or perhaps transition to a different company that would lead me to make more money, but in order to do that, there were a couple of things that had to happen. First, there wasn't a guarantee, and so I had to take a leap of faith into making this transition to the company I'm with now, that it was going to work. But, under the conditions of trying to make it work, what it was going to take for me to make it work was leaving a company that I've already had time in with for several years, already, making a certain amount of money. And, it was going to take me having to take a pay cut. I was going to actually have to lose kind of like a company vehicle at the time, to do a little bit of schooling to advance me into the company that I am with now. So there was this point to where, I had moved forward in the company. I had moved up to this position of what I was making per hour, and everything, right? And I had spent time working my way to where I was essentially capped. But in order for me to grow, in order for me to try to get even higher than that, right, it was going to take me having to leave that company to pursue another company where that potential to earn more was there. But it wasn't a straight transition over. It wasn't like I was able to just jump straight from where I was at to this other company and make more right away. It kind of took me having to go back a bit in order to move forward a bit. And so what I mean by that was, again, I had to take essentially a pay cut from the company that I was working at to where I am now, because there was a period of time where I needed just a little bit more education, learn a little bit more skills that were going to to allow me to excel with this new company that I'm with. So during that duration, though, right, I had to kind of go backward, even though I had already moved forward. I had to go backward in terms of how much I was getting paid per hour, right? In terms of I had to take some cuts for temporary, just so I can, go and get some schooling things done. And then, I had already kind of transitioned into this new company, but I wasn't going to be able to make my full match of what I was going to be able to make with this new company that I'm with until I finished that school. But when I look at it now, right, me taking a few steps back, right, with me having to take a pay cut was temporary. It wasn't forever. But because I was willing to take a few steps back and lose a couple of things temporarily, it allowed me to excel even further, because now I make a whole lot more than I make at the company I was with previously. And so that's just an example that sometimes in life, in order for us to move forward, there are times where we have to go backwards, And as I was hearing Andy Frisella talk about this with a guest that he had, he had a guest who was kind of stuck in life. He was middle-aged. He'd been working the same career for a very long time, kind of burnt out, didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to change, how to transition. He'd already was making a good living, but it's just not necessarily where this gentleman wanted to be. And so, Andy was kind of discussing this whole thing about, sometimes having to start new, sometimes, having to get to that point of where we really want to in life. At times it means us having to go back a bit. And what he meant for this gentleman was, in order for you to progress forward, to move even forward because you feel stuck now, that might mean you may need to take a few years of maybe cutting back on your lifestyle, of maybe taking a pay cut, right? Of maybe delaying some gratification in certain areas. So, he could allow himself the ability to, if he cuts back on his lifestyle or maybe where he's putting money into for whatever it may be, cut back on things so that it will allow him opportunities to try to find a new adventure, right? To maybe go and learn a new skill, whatever it could be. But it would take having to go back from what he had already built for a few years to try to build something bigger, to build something different, to get somewhere where he really wants in life. But that's what he was saying, that sometimes that's what must be done in order to, excel forward. I think a lot about this right now in my life, right? Because I'm making a couple of transitions, especially financially, to try to pull myself back, a bit. That way I could pull myself forward. So I began a process, over this last month of just selling things that I didn't necessarily need. I wanted, but didn't need right now. I began working on a lot of my financial stuff over the last month, paying off some debt, selling things I didn't necessarily need, although I wanted right now. I had a couple of motorcycles, had some payments on them, and really began that process, right? And it's like I've already got to this point where I accumulated, certain things, and I've gotten used to living a certain lifestyle. But as I take a look at my life and where I'm at now and where I want to be 5 years from now, I know that comes with me having to make some sacrifices, with me having to delay some gratifications, with me having to downgrade and cut back and step back a bit from that lifestyle momentarily for a few years, so that it'll allow me the ability to, to have the opportunities to move even further in a few years than where I am at now. And so for me, a lot of this looks like cutting back on that lifestyle, right? Cutting back on some of the toys that I've had, cutting back on some of the expenses of things that, I'm paying for. Really trying to do my best to live below my means, to get to that point where I'm close to it, so generally just cutting back on a lifestyle, that I've built, that I worked hard for, that I work for daily, hard to earn. But I understand, and getting all this from that podcast I was listening to with Andy Frisella, was that sometimes it's a necessity, right? Sometimes it's an absolute necessity for us to go back, perhaps delay some gratifications, perhaps, strip down our lifestyle a bit, maybe if it meant downgrading an expensive home that we're living in, or downgrading a nicer car that we're driving, or downgrading the amount of toys that we have, or whatever it is, as a way of stepping back a bit. That way it gives us a chance, right? Because when we can start to do stuff like that, we free up money that's getting tied into things. We free up the ability to have more time to then, jump on opportunities that can build a bigger life in the future, build the things that we want, design a life that we want, and then we can get past a point to where we're at now even further by doing that. And so that's a lot of what I've been trying to think about as I think about my journeys. I think about where I want to be 5 years from now, as where I want to be in the future. And it's something that not a lot of people are willing to do, especially when you get used to a certain lifestyle. When you have this idea in your head that you worked so hard to this point of life to have the things that we have, to live a way that we live, it can be very hard to start stripping some of that away, right? Downgrading things, taking those step backs. But, as he was talking about it in this podcast, if we're able to do that, if we're able to cut back and step back for a few years, try to live very minimalistic, try to avoid, being into debt, try to avoid things that are going to take time and focus and energy away from us, that would distract us. If we're able to do that for a short few years, then we can spend the next so many years of the rest of our life at a further point than where we are at now, where we are living now. And again, it's a very hard thing for many people to do, for sure, because we just get used to a lifestyle that we get used to. It can be hard to cut back after you work so hard to earn, put time into things to achieve the things that we've got. But if we're stuck, or if we want more, then it has to become part of the process, part of the journey, part of the necessity. And as I've looked into people's journeys, right? Journeys of people who were living a life. Maybe they were working a 9-to-5 they didn't want, living a life that they didn't want, at a job they didn't like, didn't have the bank account they wanted, lived in a home that they wanted, lived, a lifestyle that they wanted. And they finally made a change, right? And so many years later, they finally got what it was that they wanted, but they worked for it. All of it came down to, a lot of it was they all had to take a step down in life, right? Maybe they were living an okay life with materialistic things and such, right? But, a lot of the stories where I get to hear people who get to that point, they had to step back, right? Sometimes they had to cut their expenses. They had to cut the lifestyle that they're used to, maybe stop buying nice clothes, maybe start shopping at Goodwill places or whatever, right? Find discounts, or not buy so much clothing, or go shopping so much. Sometimes it meant them having to give up the nicer, newer car that they've been driving to drive something a little bit older, a little bit more worn down, let's say, a little bit more beat up, not necessarily beat up, something a little bit older that's used, that's not so nice and new. I see all these changes that they made in their lifestyle, but that's what allowed them to step back and to move back. But then eventually allowed them to move forward even much more so, because by doing that, by making those sacrifices, delaying those gratifications, cutting back on their lifestyle, cutting back their expenses, eliminating distractions, it opened them up for opportunities to then begin to build a life that they wanted. And I'm finding that very much true right now with my own journey and process as we're talking about all of that. Because I've accumulated all the stuff, right? I had the toys and the motorcycles and all this. And, I've gotten myself in some debt because of prior stuff. But as I've seen it, especially over the last, recent time of me changing my finances, being on top of them with paying off debt, trying to figure out my budget, trying to not spend so much, getting rid of things that were taking money away from me. I could see how when you start to pull back on these things, now I got more money in my pocket right now because I don't have payments going to toys, because I don't have payments going to things that I was trying to pay off. Now I've got money sitting there to where it's allowed me to open up a couple of bank accounts. One is an online high yield savings account, which gives you more interest than just a normal bank would, right? So I have money now available to put in there to help grow and save for things. And then I've got another bank account I started to where I'm just going to feed money in there for some real estate investments in the future. And so being able to cut back from some of this lifestyle, being able to step back as I'm trying to find other ways to step back and kind of live, more minimal for now, I can see how that's really going to benefit me to get me to where I want to get to in the future, because it's allowing me the capital to be freed up to now start putting into things to find those opportunities that's going to lead me to where I want to go and other things as well, and also eliminating distractions at the same time and a few other things. And so, I definitely understand what Andy Frisella was saying, and this is the guy who himself, right, was talking about, he's been there. He's had to step back to move forward. He's had to take the pay cuts. He's had to say no to things. He's had to cut his lifestyle in half. He had to essentially seem like he was going backwards for the things that he had worked up at a certain point of life, to then allow it to move him further than what he was before. And so as I continue on in my own journey of really trying to build, financial wealth, build upon my health, and build the lifestyle that I want to live, I see that sometimes going back is not a bad thing, because I think a lot of times we associate going backwards as a bad thing, as we're losing progress, as we're going backwards as being, again, not a so good thing. But if we can look at it as a way for the further we can kind of go back, the further it could propel us, then maybe we'll have a different relationship with understanding that, right? And I just see that quite a bit in people's journeys who transformed their life over a few years. Sometimes, again, they were living a pretty good life. When I see people who went from a life they didn't necessarily like, a job that they didn't like, whatever it was, to where they built a life that they did like, a lot of it came from them having to step back, from them having to cut again expenses, maybe downgrade where they're living, downgrade their vehicle, downgrade the lifestyle, just so it allowed them, money to invest into the things and opportunities that would allow them to build the life that they wanted to. And it was only for a few years, and then they finally got to where they wanted to, and then had what they got back, and even more so. So, I think we just got to be willing to understand that, and willing to accept that sometimes going backward doesn't mean we got to stay stuck there. Sometimes going backwards is the best thing that we can do to launch us forward. And again, I remind myself in the recent years to where I transitioned from one company to another company, and I had to go back a bit because I had to take a pay cut. I had to go back and do some schooling. There were a couple of cuts that I had to take, and it seemed like I was going backwards to everything I had just worked up to. But because I was willing to, because I took the chance, I took the risk, I took the leap of faith, right? Because I was willing to do that for a short temporary time, once I transitioned to my other, job and employer that I'm currently at, I now make a lot more than I did at the other company. But it wouldn't have happened if I wasn't willing to take some pay cuts, to go back a bit, to take some time to do a little bit of schooling to help, with my skill set that I would be able to use where I'm at now. And so I associate it now with a good thing, because had I not done that, I would have still been there. I would have still been maxed out. I probably wouldn't have been making any more money. I would have been exactly where I was. But because I was willing to let go and willing to take a little bit of a cut and willing to go backwards, it put me so much more further ahead, and in not a very long time. It all took about a year from the time I left and took a little bit of a pay cut, had to do a little bit of schooling, to a year later I was fully maxed out with my new pay, this new company, which was a lot more than where I was at. So don't always think going backwards is a bad thing. A lot of times, if we really want to go super far ahead, it has to be a necessity. It has to be a must, And I think, though, sometimes we think it's going to be forever, and it's not going to be. So we sometimes probably rather stay in the comfort of being where we're at because, it doesn't feel good at times. I'll be honest, right? Like, when I was making that transition from that company to this, didn't feel good. No, I had worked my way to make the amount of money I made, and now I'm going to take a cut for a while. I knew I was going to get it back, but it still was a point that I knew that for a year I was going to take a pay cut, and it forced me to keep an eye on my budgeting and stuff like that. But ultimately, it worked out for the best, right? And I think about it too, even, with my toys that I got and stuff like that, I sold them because I know God was calling me to do something bigger right now. And it was telling me I need to get rid of these things just because I need to pay off some other stuff. I need to refocus where my money's going to, because I just feel God's got something big working in me, on me, with me in life. But it doesn't feel good, getting rid of it because it brought me joy. I enjoyed having them. They were a fun time. They were stress relief. All these different things. I worked hard. I worked hard for them. And felt I deserved to enjoy those, right? So it was kind of tough getting rid of them in a sense, just because, you never want to lose things that you buy because you work hard to buy them and enjoy them for a reason, right? So it's not an easy process, but understanding the bigger picture of it, my goal is to never not have the nice things like the toys I had. The goal for me is to have a lot nicer than those and a lot more of those. So if I'm willing to temporarily give up some things, for a short time and go back a little bit on the lifestyle and all of that stuff, then it can only help create a bigger lifestyle for me in the future, right? Help create more opportunities and a bigger life in the end. And so the thing again here is this, right? Sometimes it is a necessity for us to have to go backwards in order for us to go forwards. And so don't ever look at going backwards as a bad thing because we don't have to stay stuck there. Just think of it as short-term discomfort for the trade-off of something even bigger in the future, right? Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. And as always, I will see you on the next one.